High foothills. The following morning was cloudy, but the clouds soon dissolved in the sun. As I walked up the forest path to the next ridge, I felt myself to be near the threshold of the high hills. The anemones increased in number as I climbed, whilst hosts of buttercups spread a golden carpet over the dew-drenched turf. Many sheep and goats laden with grain were following the same path on their way to the upper valley of Garhwal, where the grain is transferred to yaks and jhobas, half-breed yaks, then taken over the high passes into Tibet. Ponies are sometimes employed for load carrying, but the bulk of the grain is carried in little bags reinforced with leather on the backs of sheep and goats. The sheep carrying some 20 to 25 pounds and the goats as much as 30 pounds. The drivers are ragged, picturesque, friendly fellows, some with long curly hair. They walked with a shambling, flat footed gait, something like that of the alpine guide, and two or three of them will share a long water pipe with a wide shallow bowl, which they fill with villainous tobacco mixed with charcoal, or when no tobacco is available, charcoal alone. Smoking one of the pipes is something of a ritual. A man takes two or three rapid puffs, then hands on the pipe to his neighbor, so that the pipe soon goes the round of a dozen men. In this way, asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning is avoided. Thunder was rumbling in the west as I breasted the ridge above the Ramni, but the north and east was clear, and Nanta Gunti stood revealed in all its beauty. This peak is 20,700 feet high and is so beautifully proportioned that it appears almost as high as its greater neighbor Trisul. On the far side of the ridge, the path descended through forests, crossing occasional glades. I remembered the Horsworth found Peonia Imodi hereabouts, and I kept my eye open. But I did not see one until I was within half a mile of the camping ground. Then suddenly, in a shady place and close to the path, I saw a clump of them. The day was dark now, for a storm was brewing, but even in the gloom of the forest, their cream-colored blooms shone out as though retaining the recent sunlight in their petals. The clumps was the only one in the bloom, as the rest were already seeding. This place must be a marvelous sight in April and the first week of the May, for this peony blooms early, pushing its way like the alpine crocus through the edges of the retreating snows. I remembered Same Karak as one of the most delightful camping ground we had seen during the march to Kamet. But now hills and forests were burdened with impending storm, and the little Alps seemed dreary and forlorn. Thunder was growling about the hills when I arrived, but I did not have to wait long for the men, who were just in time to pitch the tents before rain fell in torrents. For the next 2 hours, lightning darted viciously at the forest clad ridges, and the thunder reverberated from lip to lip of the cup shaped hills. Then, towards evening, with that suddenness peculiar to mountainous countries, the rain and the thunder ceased, and the clouds vanished as though absorbed by some invisible vacuum cleaner. The men collected wood from the forest, and soon a great fire was blazing. It was my first campfire, and I sat by it contentedly while the golden sunlight died on the nearer heights, then fired the distant snows of Nanda Gunti. Nothing had altered since we camped here in 1931, and there was even the same half-burnt tree stump where our fire had been lit. Possibly the slender oaks and conifers had added a few inches to the stature, but for the rest, Same Karak was the same. Things do not change quickly in the East. Raymond Green, a born raconteur, had kept us amused with stories throughout the evening. 6 years has passed, but I would not regret them, for the peace and beauty of the hills was mine that evening. The last cloud vanished the glass globe faded from the Nanda Gunti, and the sky lit up with stars. Not a breath of wind stirred in the treetops. Darkness fell, I ate my supper, then smoked my pipe and dreamed, until the fire had died down to a heap of glowing embers and the dew lay hoary on the grass. Next morning, I descended into Barehi Valley, passing through hundreds of acres of peonies in seed. The seed was unripe, but I gathered some, hoping to ripen it later. I know now that this is difficult, if not impossible, in case of peony, for the seed shrivels and becomes valueless. It must be gathered when it is perfectly ripe and ready to fall out of the pod. The path crosses a small log bridge over the river near a vertical crag of crumbling rock, beneath which some drovers, disregarding the law of gravity, had camped for the night. We exchanged greetings as it is customary in this country. They inquired as to where I was going and from where I came. From the river, the path zigzagged steeply upwards, then traversed the hillside almost levelly, although forest of tree, rhododendrons, roses, and a white sweet scented flower shrub to the camping ground at Kalia Ghat, which is in an open grassy place sprinkled with large boulders. Adjoining it are cultivated fields beyond which rise a vast wall of forest, broken high up by gigantic crags. Many queer noises came from this forest, including the whistle like cries of a bird, and once I heard a coughing sound which was probably made by a bear or a panther. The afternoon was hot and fly ridden. It was impossible to sit outside my tent without being pestered by innumerable flies, while inside it was like an oven. So I occupied myself with collecting flowers for my press. It was a beautiful evening, but the flies, as is usual in Garhwal, were replaced by midgets, which, although small, seem capable of biting through the roughest skin, to judge from the exasperated scratches of the porters. From Kalia Ghat, a pleasant path crosses meadows, then through rhododendron and oak forest, led to a wide alpgay with white and blue anemones obtusiloba, within a view of the Kuari Pass, which cuts a notch in a ridge. Thenceforward, the route lies across steep craggy hillsides, then past an impressive gorge where a stream spurts out of a narrow cleft to form a perfect bathing pool, and finally, after sundry ups and downs, mounts towards the pass. As I was well ahead of the porters, I seated myself with my back to a mossy bank where grew the delicate sprays of a beautiful little Androsaceae, probably Androsaceae rodentifolia, and ate the lunch provided by Tewang. I had not been there long before I heard a footfall, and looking up saw a wild-looking fellow with a long-handled axe over his shoulder, regarding me with the greater curiosity. As soon as he saw that I was disposed to be friendly, he squatted on the ground and burst into an unintelligible gabble. Probably he had seen no one to talk to for some time and was making the best of his opportunity. My very limited stock of Urdu elicited that he was there with his folk for the summer and that he lived in Kalia Ghat. Apart from this, our conversation was limited to gestures and smiles, which, however, are very good substitutes for speech in the wild. I gave him some tobacco and he departed beamingly. Presently along came the Doshiels as usual. In spite of their heavy loads, they were happy and were singing their rhythmical little songs. We lunched at Dakwani, a fertile alp 1000 feet below the Kuari Pass. There I saw many iris commonenses in bloom. This little iris, a miniature edition of the English garden iris, grows on hot, well-drained, sunny slopes. All it asks for is a cool root run. Then, when the winter snow melts, it pushes out in its thin leaves, and a little later its spire of purple blooms, which partake in color of cold, shadowed snow and rich blue sky. It grows well in England, and I have one in my own garden, which brings to me every spring a memory of the Himalayas. Dakwani is the usual camping ground, but I determined to push on the camp on the pass, for this is a renowned viewpoint and commands a prospect extending from the Nanda Devi group of to the peaks of Badrinath. Accordingly, I left the main transport at Dakwani and with 3 dazzling men and 4 docial climbed a zigzag stony track to the pass. The crest is not the best viewpoint, and I camped on a rocky ridge some distance to the east, where there are no near hills to interfere with the panorama. Unfortunately, clouds and haze concealed most of the peaks, but I hoped that the following morning would afford a clear view, particularly of the Zaskar range, into which the Bhayandar valley cuts, and the peaks I hoped to climb during the next few weeks. The evening was dark and dense clouds massed along the haze-filled Alaknanda valley. We hoped that no thunderstorm was brewing at the camp was as the camp was exposed was in an exposed position, and we had no wish to repeat the experience of Saptal. The men had carried up some wood from Dakwani, but there was plenty of dwarf rhododendron available, the sight of which delighted the Tibetans, as it reminded them of their native land, it in many parts of which it is the only fuel apart from dried yak dung. Winter snow still covered large areas of the hillside, but already a tiny gentian with daintily frilled petals carpeted the ground. At sunset, the dark clouds delivered a sharp hailstorm, but later the sky cleared somewhat, revealing scattered stars. After hot marches across the foothills, it was good to feel the need of a sweater and the warmth of an eider down sleeping bag. Better still, there were no flies and or midges, and I could sleep with the tent flaps wide open. The tonic of the high places was in the air. So far, I had lived with little thoughts of the future, my thoughts circumscribed by the day's march, but now for the first time I experienced that feeling of expectancy which every mountaineer has when approaching high mountains. A restful sleep, and I woke up as usual with the first light, but there was no view above and below. Sluggish vapors concealed the glorious panorama which I had seen in 1931 from the same place. The Tibetans were so disappointed as I, for they was anxious for a glimpse of the peaks we hoped to climb. Presently, the main party joined us, and we descended towards the Dholi valley, at first over open slopes, then into pine forest, and there at upper limit of the trees I came upon an old friend which I had photographed in 1931, a solitary sentinel gnarled and weather beaten by countless storms. It was decaying, for to judge from its appearance it had been maltreated by lightning, but it still stretched gaunt, hard branches against the sky, an embodiment that endured force, which epitomizes in material form the spirit of the hills. As we came out of the upper forest onto the wide alp, the clouds parted, revealing the great massif of Gauri Parvat and Hathi Parvat. Then, almost before I had time to take in the grandeur of this sudden revelation, a terrific icy spire, shining and immeasurably remote, thrust itself into the clouds. Dunagiri. The docials said they were certain of the path to Joshimath. It is true there was a path at first, but it soon petered out in the forest. We kept on the same distance through a tangle of vegetations. Then it was brought home to us that we were lost. I was well ahead of the men and stopped. The forest was very quiet. Not a sound, not a breath disturbed the serene silence. Above the great trees formed by a canopy with their interlacing branches, and it at my feet, the deep shadows were accentuated by pools of sunlight. Vandy joined me and we yelled lustily until the men were assembled, and then we struck straight down the hillside, forcing our way through the undergrowth, and at length, to our relief, came to a path leading in direction of Joshimath. I halted for lunch by a leisurely little stream, fringed with marigolds, that wandered into a sun-drenched glade. After this, the path wound sinuously across the hillside, descending gradually as it did so into a forest of cheer. Hot and resinous in the nearly vertical noonday sun, thenceforward it was a somewhat weary march, but enlivened at one place by a number of lemurs playing about on a boulder. They allowed me to approach within a few yards of them, but looked so hostile that I felt glad of my ice axe. Beyond were numerous hamlets whose inhabitants were working industriously on their small terraced field of grains and vegetables. I asked one of them how far it was to Joshimath, and he replied 2 miles. But it was more like 4 or 5. These people have small regard for distance and measure it in time rather than mileage. The path divided, and not sure of which branch to take, I waited until a small woman driving some oxen appeared. She seemed terrified when I questioned her and hastened by with averted eyes. How many decades will be before the Indian woman is emancipated from the mental, moral, and physical slavery she has endured for countless generations? Joshimath is perched on a hillside some 1500 feet above the junction of Alaknanda and Dholi rivers. It is a halting place of pilgrims whose journey to Badrinath during the summer months to pay their respects to Mother Ganges and worship at the shrines of deities associated with the sacred snows of the Himachal or the Himalayas. Unhappily, they bring with them many diseases from the plains, and cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and malaria exact their toll from the devout, whose notions as to sanitation, cleanliness, and hygiene are at constant variance with the well intentioned preventive and remedial efforts of the Indian government. All along the road, infection is spread by hordes of flies, and he is wise traveller who boils every cup of his drinking water. The village is an ugly little place with slate of corrugated iron covered 2-storied houses straggling unbeautifully over the hillside. Primitive little shops displaying sweetmeats, vegetables, and other commodities line at the main street, which is roughly paved in places and in others has been deeply challenged by the monsoon rain. The pilgrims spent the night in the single-storied rest houses, and unlike the hovels provided by the Kentish hop pickers of the former days, some of which are situated in narrow passages running off the main street and are filthy and evil smelling. Such pestilential conditions have little effect on the pilgrims, and scores of were to be seen, many being naked save for the loincloth, seated in meditation, their thoughts fixed on the shrine at Badrinath, their sacred destination. There are numerous temples dedicated to various gods, principal among them being Vishnu, who is represented by an idol carved from black stone. Joshimath was at one time the capital of Katyuris, the rulers of Western Kumaon and Garhwal, and the successors of the Buddhists, who were driven out of Nepal, Kumaon, and Garhwal by Sankara, the indefatigable destroyer of Buddhism in India, who is thought to have lived in the 7th or 8th century. It was he who advocated pilgrimage to shrines of Shiva and Vishnu at Kedarnath and Badrinath. His disciples were established in these ancient shrines, and the consequent influx of pilgrims prevented a reversion to Buddhism. Owing to religious quarrels between the followers of the two deities, Joshimath was abandoned by the Katyuris, whose kingdom was broken up, forcing them to establish themselves as independent Rajas. Since it was first instituted, the pilgrimage to Badrinath and Kedarnath has increased in importance, and nowadays some 50,000 or 60,000 pilgrims from all parts of India, including the remote south, make their way every year up to the Alaknanda valley. Even the pilgrimage to Banaras is not so beneficial to the soul as that to the snows of the Himalayas, which bestow a bountiful their sanctity and bliss to the heart of man. It is written in Skanda Puran, he who thinks of Himachal, though he should not behold him, is greater than he who performs all worship in Kashi or Banaras. In 100 ages of the gods, I could not tell thee of the glories of Himachal. As the dew is dried up by the morning sun, so are the sins of mankind by the sight of Himachal. Doubtless, some of the old Buddhist demonolatry is responsible for the veneration in which the snows are held. It may be that the European mountaineers have something of the same superstitious instinct handed down from the days of the sun and moon worship, when the hilltops were the abiding places of gods and devils, and not long ago Mount Pilatus was reputed to be haunted by the uneasy ghost of Pontius Pilate. Understanding has replaced fear, but it may be that the shadows of ancient mysteries remain, so that the sight of high mountains rekindles in a different guise the same feeling of awe which our remote ancestors had in their presence. The Kumaun and Garhwal should be specially consecrated to the gods of Indian religious mysticism is easily understandable. Is there any region of the Himalayas as or even of the world to excel this region in beauty and grandeur? Where else are there to be found such narrow and precipitous valleys and gorges, such serene vistas of Alp, forest, snowfield, and peak? This abode of snow is rightly the goal of the heat enervated people of the plains. Never was a pilgrimage of finer accomplishment. It is the perfect antidote to a static life, and it cannot fail to inspire in the dullest a nobler conception of the universe. Below Joshimath, sins are purified by the swift running waters of Alaknanda river. From the shrines of Vishnu Prayag, the pilgrims descend a flight of steps and dip themselves in the ice cold torrent. They ascend rejuvenated in mind, and it must be in body, ready to tread the stony path that leads through the gorges to Badrinath, along the great way to final liberation of spirit. There is a bungalow at Joshimath perched on the hillside above the village, and containing one living room and a bathroom with the usual zinc hip bath, the servant quarters and the kitchen being in a separate building. In the living room are some bookshelves, the last resting place of a number of volumes of great antiquity, among them Blackwood's magazine, the Christian Science Monitor, and work of Victorian and Edwardian novelists, all of which form a restful home for small beetles, silverfish, and numerous unidentifiable insects. In these respects, the bungalow is similar to other in the district, but in one other aspect it is remarkable, being the home and breeding place of the largest spiders I had ever seen, not excluding the tarantulas of South America. The bathroom is their happy hunting ground, and I bathed that evening with one eye on the dilapidated ceiling, lest some huge brute 6 or 7 inches across should descend upon me. The men had marched well, so I rested them for a day which I devoted to letter writing. Joshimath boasts a post office, a curious, ramshackle little building with a doorway so low I had to stoop to enter. In this layer, surrounded by the usual appurtenances of his craft, a Morse key, ledgers, pigeonholes, and official notices innumerable, I found the postmaster and his assistant. In 1936, during the Mount Everest expedition, the letters sent back by the members mysteriously disappeared, to reappear some 6 or 8 months later in England bearing the following typewritten notice: suffered detention at Gangtok post office owing to the postmaster's failure to affix stamps and to forward them in time. The postmaster has been sent to jail for his offence. But any doubts I may have entertained as to the efficiency of the Indian post was dispelled by the postmaster of Joshimath, who proved not only courteous but helpful and efficient. Later, the local Bania storekeeper, a comfortable looking person who beamed amiably through thick spectacles, put in an appearance and I ordered sattu, parched barley, staple food in the central and eastern Himalayas, rice, gur, native sugar which is purchased in lumps resembling solid glue, tea, curry, ingredients, atta or the flour, spices, potatoes and onions. I bought enough to keep the four dazzling men for a fortnight, allowing 2 pounds of food per man per day, and the cost worked out at roughly 6 annas per man per day. Eggs I failed to secure, although a man was sent to scour the country for them. Late in the afternoon there was a thunderstorm, but towards sundown the clouds melted away, and with my work done and arrangements completed for the morrow's march, I reclined in an easy chair on the veranda, while a gentle breeze stirred an apricot tree above me, then fell gradually to complete calm. A rosy glow invested the great rock facing opposite, and dusk gathered in the deep Alaknanda valley. The last mist vanished in a sky of profound green, and the first star shone out. Little did I know, but this was the evening before the great tragedy on the Nanga Parvat, 400 miles on the northwest, where 7 German mountaineers and 9 Sherpa porters were settled down to a sleep from which they were destined never to awake. At Joshimath the evening was supremely peaceful, and there came to me for the first time since leaving Rani Khet an indescribable or exaltation of spirit which most travellers experience at one time or the another in Himalayas. For days past I had walked over the foothills rejoicing in scenery, yet never for one moment had I escaped civilization. It had been always at my heels, and I it has always at my heels, and I had walked with one eye on time and another distance, my mind occupied with futile matters. Now I had in some way escaped from this slavery to schedule, and was free to enjoy some of the grandest country of the world.